Our last speaker is also very impressive. A bold and brilliant graduate, 2014 graduate of Binghamton University. So Tasfia Nayem is served with President Stenger on our campus committee here on a carbon neutral campus. So she's been involved in this sort of arena for pretty much her entire academic career. She also serves on the advisory board of the National Parks Conservation Council and is a fellow of the National Resources Defense Council. She currently is a graduate student at Duke, where she teaches courses in this area. She also advises a number of groups on that campus. And in between Binghamton and Duke, she also worked at the Environmental Protection Agency. And a major charge of hers was looking for ways to communicate information about climate change. And so today, she will talk about her journey through that and her observations on where it leads us today. So, Tasfia.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be back here in Binghamton, where, as James mentioned, I did get my start working in the climate field. So I spent a lot of time in this theater, actually, watching theater performances and dance performances while I was an undergrad, but I never thought I'd be on this side of the stage, especially because no one wants to see my attempts at dancing. Today, we are going to talk about climate change. I originally was going to talk about the way that at EPA, we chose to communicate climate science, but I'm a little out of date. Nearly all of the projects I worked on while at EPA have been removed over the past year and a half. So instead today, I'm going to talking about climate change on an individual level, or specifically the way we do it, the importance of it, the way people are trying to change it, and the way we can do it going forward. And so, I'll start with myself. I think about climate change probably every waking hour of my day. I talk about it for hours, and it certainly is influenced by the fact that I go to environment school where I'm surrounded by other people like me, and so we just spend our time talking about the challenges and the opportunities and the way that we can address it and make the most impacts in our careers, but also in our own lives. But when I leave the environment building at Duke, when I go home, when I'm talking with my parents or my roommates, I'm not really talking about climate change to the same level. And that's the case for most Americans. We're not really talking about climate change. But it's not due to lack of belief either, though. So a strong majority of Americans right now acknowledge that climate change exists. It's 70%. And as for people living on the coasts, 2 out of 3 Americans say that climate change is impacting their communities already. It's already changing the way that their communities function and exist. But we see that trend going down as we go further inland. But this makes sense because the folks that live on the coast are on the front lines of addressing climate change and feeling its impacts. So I live in North Carolina right now, and you can see in this figure that in the 50s and 60s, Wilmington, North Carolina, experienced only about 2 days of flooding per year. But in recent years, it's shifted to nearly 50 days of flooding per year. And so we had a bunch of flooding recently this past month due to Hurricane Florence, and it shows that this flooding is a part of this broader trend. But North Carolina isn't alone. We see this trend in cities on both coasts all over the US. But what about outside of the US, or outside of the coast, closer inland? This figure shows the number of reported incidences of Lyme disease cases in 1996. And this is what it is in 2014. So you can see how it's significantly increased over time. And it hits home here, especially in Binghamton, where you can see we're kind of at the center of it all. When I was an undergrad, one of my classmates got Lyme disease. He was a fellow DJ at TIERTalks, and he had to be hospitalized. He had to be excused from classes, so it was really impactful to his life. But in terms of solutions and research, Binghamton is also in the center of that. So a lot of this research that's ongoing on climate change is happening here at Binghamton in the Gerudo and Shepherd labs, where I actually worked as an undergrad collecting research on how the nature preserve has different hosts of Lyme disease and the way that these trends are changing. So what about people who live completely inland and landlocked areas? They're experiencing the effects of climate change as well. This figure shows just one example of that. It shows how there has been an increase in the length of the allergy season every year over the past 20 or so years. So if you're a person living in Kansas, for example, your allergy season is about a month longer than it was 2 decades ago. And for those of you like me who have allergies, that can be pretty awful. But so we see that Americans are experiencing the impacts of climate change. We're feeling it happening to us already, whether it be in these huge devastating ways like floods or in more nuisance day-to-day ways that we may not really think about as much. And is that actually leading to a demand for policy? So Pew has been doing a survey of Americans to see what Americans think the top priority issues for the government should be. So some examples include the economy and social security and poverty. And if you're curious about where climate change falls on this list, it's pretty hard to find because we're really far down. It's one of the lowest priorities for Americans. And a lot of scientists say that the reason that this lack of prioritizing climate change exists is because people simply aren't really talking about it. So 2 out of 3 Americans rarely or never talk about climate change in their own lives. And when it comes to hearing their friends or family talk about climate change, that's pretty poor as well. 1/4 of Americans never hear people they know talk about climate change, whereas 1 out of 5 hear about it at least once a month. And what about the news? How's the media covering it? Well, the media is doing a really solid job at covering extreme weather events that are associated with climate change. So this figure shows just how many times this past summer only that these major news outlets covered the wildfires that were happening. But this is the number of times that they contextualize what's happening with climate change. So they're talking about the impacts, but not really talking about how climate change is associated with it. So why does it matter? Why does it matter that we talk about climate change? Why is it important that we talk about it? Well, when we talk about climate change as it becomes a part of our individual conversations, but also our national conversation, the more present it becomes in our lives, the more we start thinking about it and thinking of our lives in the context of climate change. And as we do that, we start to recognize the connections between climate change and the impacts that we're seeing, whether we live on the coast or live in Kansas or live in Binghamton and are watching the news and see the impacts of sea level rise in Palau. And we also start to recognize the connections between climate change and the activities that we're actually doing. So the activities that we're engaging in our own personal lives, but also our activities on a broader, more national scale as well. And as we recognize these connections, it leads to action. Action in our own lives, whether it changes the way we decide to commute, or the way we decide to eat, or the way we choose to vote or prioritize climate change. But it also leads to action nationally by impacting the way that our elected officials decide to address it, both on a national scale and international scale. And so there are a bunch of groups that are doing really cool, innovative things to get people to start talking about climate change. So this group here is the Hip Hop Caucus for Climate Change. They're really cool. What they do is they work with rappers and actors to try to really diversify the climate movement and get people to talk about it from a broader lens. And they are aiming to make the climate movement not just a Birkenstock movement. There are also a bunch of artists that are incorporating climate change as a part of their work to get people to start thinking about it and addressing it. So this includes musicians, it includes visual artists, it includes poets, like the poem we just heard. This is a still from a climate change ballet. It was a climate change influenced take on Swan Lake. But it turns out that one of the most effective strategies of addressing climate change involves all the people here in this room. Studies have found that Americans say their own family and friends have the greatest ability to convince them to take action to reduce global warming. So that means everyone in this room can have an impact greater than scientists, than politicians, than thought leaders or activists in getting people to start talking about and thinking about climate change in their own lives. And so I wanted to share just a couple of strategies that have been shown to be the most effective in getting people to talk about climate change and start thinking about climate change in an action and impact-oriented way. One is you don't have to be a scientist. One of the top reasons people say they don't talk about climate change, even if it's something that they worry about or think about, is because they don't know all of the science behind it. But you don't need to know the science. It's actually more effective to talk about your own experiences and what you're seeing in your own life. So that relates to making it personal to you. Your voice is the one that your friends and family want to hear. They don't want to hear statistics and different facts and figures. Another is making it personal to the person that you're speaking to. So, for example, climate change is so multifaceted in terms of the challenge that it presents, but also the types of solutions that we can pursue to address it, like Seth was mentioning, that there are ways to really engage people in the terms of the values that they have. So when I'm talking to my friends who have really strong nationalism, I talk about how addressing climate change with renewable energy increases our energy security and reduces our reliance on foreign oil. And also, don't scare and despair. A lot of these future projections of climate change can be pretty scary, but it turns out that sharing or focusing on these doom and gloom scenarios results in people feeling like they're unable to affect change. And so focusing on solutions is more impactful. Focusing on solutions and making people feel like they have agency as they do, whether it be on an individual level with the choices that they make in their lives, or on a national level by prioritizing climate change and voting on this issue. And lastly, stories matter. So this one is the most important one. It has been shown time and time again that sharing your climate story and storytelling about climate change and its impacts and its effects on your life is more effective than figures, than science, than facts, than reports, than anything. So it shows how when you tell your climate story, it can make such an impactful change. And so I thought I'd start with my climate story. Climate change is so closely intertwined with my own personal identity. This image that you see here, it is an image, an aerial view of the coast of Bangladesh, the country where I was born. And so what I love about this image is how, if you think about it in the context of climate change, you can start to imagine the sea slowly swallowing up the country, permanently changing its borders, and affecting the millions of people who live along these coastlines. So a story about climate change in Bangladesh that always resonates with me is this article I read in Reuters a couple of years ago profiling this little girl. She's about 10 years old. She comes from a long line of farmers. So her family had been farming on this land for generations, but a mix of sea level rise and flooding resulted in their land just becoming inundated with salt water, completely depriving them of the ability to grow crops, and it made their land penniless overnight. And so her parents had to make this really tough decision to go to a different country, to India, to work in a factory in the city. And they left this daughter behind so that they could ensure that she gets her education and works at this boarding school. The story is about how this girl is just really sad and she's being left behind in school. She's been held back. And she's just crying to the author because she talks about how she just wants to be with her parents again. Like she just wants to be a family together. And I think about this story and I think about what if I was this little girl, What if I was born 100 miles south of where I was born? Or What if I wasn't born into the privilege that I had? Or what if I didn't get the chance to move to this country with my family? But then I start seeing the impacts of climate change in my life here as well. So I see climate change in my high school in downtown New York City, just flooded during Hurricane Sandy. I see climate change in the subway station that my mom takes to work every day, covered under feet of water. I see climate change on my living room couch down in North Carolina when my classmates who live on the coast ask if they can crash because they don't know if their house is okay because they've been evacuated. I also see climate change in my parents' home when we're all sitting around watching TV together and we see the news and there's a segment on wildfires, followed by a segment on drought, followed by a segment on flooding. But I also see climate change as an opportunity. I see climate change as a way to think critically about our legacy and the way we want to live on this planet. I see it as an opportunity to be really strategic and creative in how we choose to address it, both individually and collectively. I see it as an opportunity to address some of the inequities that exist, to increase energy access by providing people with rooftop solar, or to improve the health of women by reducing dirty cook stoves, or improving the health of entire communities by shifting away from dirty fossil fuels. And so I see climate change everywhere, and so I talk about it because I realize that talking about it is taking action, and I realize that talking about it is the first step to making sure we avoid the worst impacts. And so I wanted to leave you with tips on how to talk about climate change in your own lives. So if you're catching up with someone and they ask how things are going, you can say, "Man, it sure is flooding more than usual. There are life forms I've never conceived of taking residence in my basement. Wonder if it's climate change." You can talk about climate change when vacation planning. If someone asks where to go for a vacation, you can say, "You know, without climate action, Puerto Rico might have only 1% coral cover by the year 2050, according to the EPA. So pack your snorkel." You could also talk about climate change when dating. So if you've matched with someone on a dating app, you can say, "Girl, you must be the year 2100 and projections of 7 degrees of warming if we continue on our current emissions trajectory, 'cause you're hot." All right, thank you.